In my opinion, Vladimir Putin is the most powerful man in the world. Many think Donald Trump is, but the American system was set up specifically to limit his power. Russian politics doesn't have the same limits, which is one of the reasons why Putin has been able to annihilate his political opponents. No other politicians stand a chance of beating him in elections. He's the most openly gangster head of state, and that is partly why he's been so successful. We always hear about how the Russian people love strong leaders, and that's why they love Putin. But that's not why they elect him. They elect him because he's a strategic genius. His career began in the KGB, for which he recruited spies in East Germany. We don't know much else about what he did in the KGB, but it's fair to assume it was a dark chapter of his life. Putin was always good at identifying political allies to befriend, and in 1991 he became foreign affairs advisor to the mayor of Leningrad. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he joined the first major political party other than the Communist Party. That party soon gained power, and after 8 years he was chosen as their presidential candidate. He was the second president of Russia, gaining 53% of the vote in 2000. In the 2004 election he gained 71%. How did he become so much more popular in just 4 years? Well, Russia was still developing into a modern nation state at the time. It was chaotic, and Vladimir Putin is the master of chaos. As a strongman-style leader, chaos just makes him look like a safe pair of hands. But he uses chaos well by promoting it within Western countries. For years now, his administration has been funding political parties in other European nations. Parties like Golden Dawn in Greece. Parties who pose a threat to the establishment, whose rise to power would destabilize their society. It's part of his strategy to destabilize other European countries. That's why he allowed the overthrow of Gaddafi. Gaddafi was the Libyan dictator until his overthrow by violent revolution. That revolution was supported by NATO, who carried out airstrikes on his forces. It was a major factor in his defeat. Russia was on the UN Security Council. They could have vetoed Western airstrikes on Libya, but they did not. Putin knew the overthrow of Gaddafi would ultimately destabilize Western Europe. He knew Libya would splinter into several different failed states, and that would cause a mass movement of refugees towards Europe. Looking back, many of the refugees did come from Libya. The refugee crisis has already cost Europe a lot of money. It's projected to cost Germany $50 billion by the end of this year. But the biggest impact of the crisis is the rise of populist parties, the type of parties Russia has been supporting for years, which I mentioned earlier. Some of these parties are now major political forces. This is a dream come true for Putin. Now, even Putin isn't gifted enough to predict all of this, but he knew serious destabilization would follow, and these are just the things we know the Russians are doing. They could secretly be causing all kinds of chaos. The media say they influenced the US election last year. I haven't seen any evidence to support that claim, so I can't credit Putin with that. We know he knew Gaddafi's overthrow would cause a migrant problem, as he usually objects to similar actions on those grounds. Behind all the chaos, Putin is a cold strategist. This can most clearly be seen in his support for Russian allies, specifically Iran and Syria. The Soviet Union signed a secret military pact with Syria in 1946, and they've been close allies since. Russia's recent military intervention in Syria has been under the guise of fighting ISIS. This means he can label anyone who criticizes his actions as an ISIS sympathizer, and he does this at every opportunity, accusing the West of impotence on the issue. He's a very good rhetorician. Here's an example of his rhetoric. In February, there was an agreement between France, Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. We urged Ukraine not to use force. Then armed radicals seized the presidential palace, and if Western Europe had said, if you continue to act this way, you will never be part of Europe, I'm confident that we would not have a civil war in Ukraine right now. There would not be numerous victims. This is not what Europe did. I believe we were right and they were wrong. This kind of concise message can be very effective when given consistently, and for many years he's been pushing the same narrative. This makes him different from Western leaders who don't tend to be clear and concise. Vladimir Putin wants the former Soviet Union states to reunite under his leadership. This would create a symbolic empire. It wouldn't be as powerful as the Soviet Union was, but it doesn't need to be. Just as Saul Alinsky gave his first rule for radicals, power is not only what you have, but what your opponent thinks you have. If Putin can create the illusion of a Soviet-style empire, he will instantly gain more power. And sure enough, Putin has been forging closer ties with the former Soviet republics. There has even been a mountain named after him in Kyrgyzstan. It's literally called Vladimir Putin Peak. His diplomatic efforts have seen the Kremlin achieve influence in many surrounding nations. Until recently, these efforts were largely ignored by the West. But when Russia struck a deal with Ukraine, the Ukrainian president was overthrown by a violent mob. The mob was encouraged to do so by American and German politicians. That's how desperate they are to stop Putin's diplomatic efforts. It seems to be his ultimate plan, to reunite the old Union and become a neo-Tsar. With access to that much land and its natural resources, Russia would once again be a major world power. It's too early to say, but Putin may see this happen. In my view, that alone makes him a strategic genius. Oh, and by the way, I'm not saying this in support of Putin. I don't like him, I just think he's a genius.
The entire globe, even as it trembles in passion with the birth of new nations and shrinks in the hand of a dispassionate science, is today the site of a momentous conflict. As each side attempts to prove to the world the superiority of its position, the conflict is fought with the words of diplomats, with gestures of friendship and help to uncommitted countries, even with cultural demonstrations. It is fought indeed on every level of man's experience, for the stakes are high. As one of the adversaries in the conflict, we see a challenge as great as any in our historic past. A challenge not, we hope, to be met and joined in battle, but to be faced and fought in the hearts and hopes of men.